Hi, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and today I am doing another episode of Planets in Profile. I'm finally finishing my series on Mars through the signs. So this one, we're looking at Mars in Aquarius, and I apologize that this has been late in coming. For some reason, I thought that I had recorded Mars in Aquarius last year, but it turns out that this was the very last episode of the Mars through all of the 12 signs video that I needed to do. So sorry, better late than never. So let's take a look at Mars in Aquarius. Now, this transit of Mars is, I think, one of the most peculiar and interesting transits of Mars in general. Let me put this into full screen mode first. Let's go ahead and talk about it. So we're looking at Mars in the sign of Aquarius, which is the hot, moist, fixed, masculine air sign of Saturn. So traditionally speaking, this was Saturn's masculine domicile, whereas Capricorn was Saturn's feminine domicile, or you could think about it as yin and yang. Mars in any sign, remember this, anytime you analyze a planet in a sign other than its own, it is as though the planet has to be mixed or blended with another planet. You think about it like a house guest. Mars is the house guest when it's in Aquarius, and Saturn is the host. So you're going to get a Mars-Saturn combination. Now, Mars is going to express itself thus through the lens of these qualities, most importantly, the Saturnine qualities, but let's put them all together. It's Saturnine, it's hot and moist, it's fixed, and it's masculine. Remember also the solar seasonal qualities of Aquarius and the mythology of Aquarius. That can be very helpful. So let's refresh on all of those. Remember that Aquarius is the sign of the water pourer, who is associated with the Greek youth, Ganymedes. And Ganymede is taken up to heaven by Zeus. He's abducted. He's an attractive young man who is sort of ideal, full of potential, and he's coveted by the gods. Comes to be the cupbearer of the gods. This does two things. This alienates him from other people. Ganymedes, on the one hand, is, he's going to be, he's up with the gods, which is nice, but he's alienated from other human beings. You can imagine if your sister or a friend of yours suddenly got whisked up to heaven and you were like, well, wait, why are they so cool? Like, what about me? So jealousy, misunderstanding, alienation are an inherent part of the Ganymede mythology, and they are also very relevant for Aquarius. Aquarius is related to the potential of youth. This is a sign that is bringing with it a promise of spring to come, the water pourer, and coming out of the winter, out of the depths of winter. And so there is a sense of that rare, promising potential, but there's also distance from it. There's also a sense of it being far away. You think in the middle of winter, you get one of those nice days that pops out of nowhere, and you go, like spring is back, and then it goes away really quickly. It's like a glimmer of hope in the midst of darkness. Something like that is taking place in Aquarius too, where there is often this emphasis on the youthful potential, but the youthful potential often exists in stark contrast to the status quo, right? So if you think about the grunge movement of the early 90s, this was something that was being done, led by the youth in resistance to normalcy. Like, let's do something alternative, because the alternative is to be normal, and normal isn't desirable. So Aquarius is like that. It's the promising young special youth that is taken or plucked away from the status quo. But therefore, the dichotomy between the status quo, between what is currently accepted as the status quo, and that thing that glimmers with hope in the future, that's an Aquarian dynamic. And Saturn is the lord of that dim, distant boundary between the visible and the known, and that which is beyond or unknown. Similarly, Janus, the double-faced Roman god, looks backward and forward in time, and Saturn looks to the golden age as the lost past, like the phrase that's politically been in the news over the past years, right? Make America great again. That's a Saturnine phrase. Just as similarly, people say, "Oh, that's a conservative phrase in our American political system." Conservative voters like that phrase. Well, what do progressive voters like? On the other hand, progressive voters will like something like, let's make a better, brighter future, right? So similarly, the notion of progress in the future or progress in the past, both Saturnine things that have to do with dissatisfaction with the status quo. And so when there's dissatisfaction with the status quo, one looks to the past or one looks to the future. The golden age of Kronos and Saturn, or to a future age or something like that. So you have this this sense of the outcast, and that person, that young person who doesn't fit the status quo, but might be kind of interesting, kind of appealing, kind of attractive because they stand out, and they carry with them a kind of stigma. So Saturn and Aquarius also represent the black sheep, the progressive, rebellious, dissident, but attractive rebel or outlaw, and also the inventive, but also the eccentric. They represent a vision of the future, and also a kind of a sternness, or a sense of being dissatisfied with the status quo. Weirdly, a person's progressive nature can become a kind of intense, calcified hardness. The revolutionary can become the next fossil, the next tyrant. And so these dualities of qualities, remember that Saturn traditionally rules oppositions. So Saturn is a planet associated with dualities in the way that they dueling opposites entangle with one another. Okay, so all of that being said, you also have a pretty intellectual sign, a pretty social sign, one that is hot, moist, and fixed. So often very kind of fixed in its Mars being very fixed in its expression of masculinity, but it's very Saturnine, which can be kind of cool, cold, and distant. Very interesting combination of qualities. And I picked a bunch of names. There's more you could pick that might even be better than the ones that I've picked. But these are some that I thought illustrated this very interesting combination of Mars expressing through the lens of Saturn. So I picked Fred Rogers. He is on my list for sure. Mr. Rogers was a Mars in Aquarius. How does that fit? Well, here's someone who had a sort of an agape vision of the future, and he thought that the world could be made a better place, especially through television for children. So in this sense, it's interesting because he had this kind of progressive vision, and he was dissatisfied with the way that media was being used and what he felt like might, sort of rot kids' brains. But also he was an outcast, and he was picked on when he was little. He was chubby and didn't feel good about himself. It's very interesting. Kind of outsider becomes progressive, literally works with children, sees their promise. Says that. A lot of Ganymedes in Fred Rogers. Bobby Fischer, he's the chosen Ganymede genius chess player, right? And then there's other like youthful figures who become these incredible savior, inventor, promising, like promised children, right? For example, Lance Armstrong, when he was really, really young, started winning tons of athletic sporting competitions and became this like iconic superstar of cycling world. But Saturn also traditionally ruled feigned appearances. So what does the young, 90s grunge rock say about the status quo? It's all fake. It's just status quo. It's just hollow. So similarly, sometimes there can be a coldness, a coolness, a distance, almost like a hollowness or a kind of automaton type of quality. If you ever watched Fred Rogers speak, he's very present. But my daughter, literally, who loves him, said he kind of sounds like a robot. Like, yeah, he's got Mars and Aquarius. Lance Armstrong won all those competitions, but he was doping. There was a hollowness or a fakeness to it as well. So sometimes it's cool or cold or distant. Sometimes it feels a little robotic, or sometimes it's a little fake. And there can be an interest in these kinds of things. I mean, it's just really remarkable when you start looking at it. For example, J.D. Salinger, who wrote Catcher in the Rye, really young man, kind of Ganymede figure in his novel Catcher in the Rye, who is disillusioned with the status quo and who is this weird kind of outcast, but he's also kind of robotic and depressive in a weird way. Well, think about other authors that were like this. David Foster Wallace, Kurt Vonnegut, J.D. Salinger. Think of filmmakers like Lars von Trier, if you know his work. They all have similar kind of dark, futuristic themes, but they also have this kind of brilliant, flaming, visionary qualities as well. I know I'm not probably giving the best words to it, but um, yeah. So anyway, think about Andy Kaufman. Andy Kaufman, of course, the famous comedian who Jim Carrey ended up portraying, and it really changed his life in the movie about his life, which is called Man on the Moon. Andy Kaufman also had that kind of distant but very promising otherworldly special quality about him in the way that he sort of expressed his his masculine energy in the world. You have more straight up, like, kind of punk quality like Axl Rose, but Axl Rose was the definition of like the cool rocker, and think about Hollywood stars and the way that their sex appeal works, like Matt Dillon or Penn Badgley, both cool, smoldering, but a little icy, like cool like ice, but also, attractive. Matt Dillon, Penn Badgley. Penn actually is someone that I had a chance to meet back when I was directing the ayahuasca monologues in New York City. Penn came and told a story about an ayahuasca experience that he had. Really nice guy. Julian Assange. Julian Assange also, and he played a promising, misunderstood bad boy in whatever it was, like not a kid show, but it was like a teenage show. It was called Gossip Girl. Julian Assange, of course, is similar in that he is this kind of revolutionary figure. He's a progressive, promising, young, he's got his skateboards going up and down the hall of the embassy he's jailed in. He has this kind of rebel youth quality to him, but he also resists the status quo. Nicholas Copernicus was very similar in that Copernicus was, obviously astronomical revolutionary and was deemed a heretic by the Catholic Church at first. Then also you think about people like, where am I on my list? Leonardo da Vinci, progressive genius, inventor, multiple Renaissance man. Jay-Z and Tupac. How about Jay-Z and Tupac? Both were like these promising, rebellious Ganymede figures, or their masculine energy was expressed both in their visionary, progressive kind of qualities and railing against the status quo. And yet, interestingly, like Jay-Z now is like basically has an empire, right? So you see kind of like the promising young youth who also can end up like kind of having an empire. Hugh Hefner is very similar story, where you have the playboy motif and eventually kind of having his own empire. So that also there can be this theme of like a promising youthful person who rises to some degree of status or success, but then that status or success is somehow called into question or doubted, like Lance Armstrong, or in this case, there's been a lot of criticism directed at Jay-Z since he basically became a, entrepreneurial, megastar. Similarly, like Tupac is like Ganymede, he's taken from us too early. Elon Musk is an inventor. He's kind of has a little bit of the Leonardo da Vinci thing going on. He's also eccentric. You know what I mean? Floyd Mayweather, similarly, kind of this upstart young kid, comes from nothing, becomes an empire of boxing success. But he has that similar, like he's the chosen one, but it's very alienating, and he's very eccentric, and also a lot of his success has been called into question later in life, which can happen. It's this Mars-Saturn dynamic where the strength is eventually looked at as perhaps it can get crusty, or it can even it can calcify and become kind of rigid, and can become like what it originally opposes. Anyway, like you also have really polarized figures in media, like Rush Limbaugh versus Rachel Maddow. Both of them have Mars in Aquarius. Both of them have very strong, they both were like also very youthful, promising youthful figures who came up in the media world, but on different ends of the spectrum, of course. Rachel Maddow, first openly gay lesbian news anchor, I think. And of course, Rush Limbaugh is on the conservative end of the spectrum, but they both have this kind of this sense of pushing the barriers, pushing the limits or the boundaries, which Saturn loves to do. Saturn is the lord of boundaries, but also of the dichotomy and polarization between what's on the status quo and what's outside the status quo. Rachel Maddow, very aggressive in pushing on, whatever the status quo is. She has a way of kind of pushing the envelope. Rush Limbaugh does the same thing on the opposite side of the spectrum. You have also like really eclectic or eccentric figures in sports, like Lance Armstrong, but also Kyrie Irving, who's a basketball player who famously started, sort of espousing the belief that that the earth was flat, recently. I'm sorry if anyone out there believes that. Just can't get down with that particular, can't give you much sympathy there. But anyway, Tony Robbins is another interesting one, where you have, again, a story out of like making something out of yourself, and this kind of story of promise and progress in the future. And yet, of course, he's someone who also becomes like Mars and Saturn's sign. There's a weird way in which you can be an outsider, and then there's a way in which by pushing the envelope, by resisting the status quo, you become it. You become the image of wealth or status or success. And now you can do it. Just take my seminar, whatever the case might be. And I'm not trying to criticize anyone here. Just get the general archetypal picture. Let's see. I think that goes through pretty much Rilke. I won't go into that so much, but Rilke, a great poet who had Mars in Aquarius as well. Yeah, I think that just about does it. So you get the feeling: cool, cold, distant, outsider, progressive, inventive. Sometimes the success through the resistance of the status quo ends up becoming the status quo. The heretic turned into the institution, right? Nicholas Copernicus's ideas were heretical at first. Now they are mainstream. And I'm not saying that because they're mainstream, that's a bad thing in the case of Copernicus, right? But you get what I'm saying. All right, that's what I've got for you guys. I would love to hear how Mars has showed up in your life if you were born with Mars in Aquarius. How do you see yourself in any of these people or any of these plot lines that we've been talking about, any of these archetypal combinations? I'd love to hear from you. And thank you for following along with the series. Sorry, again, I was late with Mars in Aquarius, but I'm glad to do it now. And that means I've finished Venus and Mars now completely. So I'll probably start moving on to Mercury next. All right, take it easy, everyone. Bye.